All right, thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. We're on the home stretch.
That's now. Right. That's what we like to call it.
The last 60 minutes or so of the inauguration this day, May 29, 2019. And during the course of this hour, we'll be discussing. We had discussions that touched on the executive-legislative relationship earlier. But this time, we're going to talk about the Executive-Judiciary, which is pretty unusual. Right. You know, usually they don't see too often. But many of the judges have seen a lot of
yes, in this
the executive in this particular dispensation.
It's been a bit different, so we see the need to talk about it.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little about that and how that impacts on what we can look forward to over the next 4 years. So to do that, let me quickly go straight into the introductions. Let me start from Professor Oyewo, Professor of Law at the University of Lagos. Thank you so much for joining us, Prof. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Let me also thank Mr. Yoju Likwede, former chairman of Abeokuta South Local Government in Lagos. Thank you. Also, Inogu.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I've been talking Lagos a lot. Let me also thank Ms. Chizo Malize, a member of the Executive Council, Women in Management, Business and Public Service, WIMBIZ. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Joe Abba is in our Abuja studios. And Dr. Abba, no pun intended, you're not last in the order of introductions. It's just that the 3 previous guests are with us in Lagos. Would have wished you were here. But all the same, thank you for joining us from our Abuja studios. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. The Bible said the last shall be the first and the first shall be the last. So I'm happy. Good evening.
Thank you. In the spirit of the first being the last and the last being the first, let me start with you directly. Yes. Executive judiciary, as I pointed out in the opening, they don't usually meet often. They don't meet often usually, but we've had a lot of interaction, if you want to call it that, between the executive and the judiciary over the last 4 years. And that has impacted both on governance and even on judicial precedents and other things. What do you make of that general interaction, the way it has unfolded in the last couple of years?
If you look at it in the round, actually, it's been quite a healthy relationship. I think a lot of reforms have gone on in the judicial sector. We've had the Administration of Criminal Justice Act passed, which is a very major piece of legislation that aims to reduce delays in the administration of justice and stop this interminable and unprofessional practice of continuously adjourning cases forever. So that has been major. We've also had a number of serious judgments that have supported the work of the executive. We've had support on issues such as whistleblowing. We've had a few things have actually gone quite well. Of course, there have been challenges in the judiciary, which has been the focus of recent engagements. But I think we mustn't throw away the improvements that have actually been made in the judiciary. There's of course a lot more to do. I mean, we shouldn't have judges writing in longhand these days and then taking forever to transcribe documents. Those sorts of things shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be having situations where judges decide when to turn up and when not to turn up. I mean, there should be some discipline in all of that. But I just got back from Kaduna this morning, where I went to deliver the inauguration lecture for the Kaduna State government. And one of the practices they have there, which is very interesting, is that there's, if you like, a quarterly informal meeting between the top 4 members of the executive, the top 4 members of the judiciary, and the top 4 members of the legislature. And they meet every quarter, completely informally, no notes taken, and just discuss, this is the policy we're going to pursue in the next few months, and this is the role that each party, each arm of government has to play in that. And I think something like that encourages that kind of dialogue is helpful. It doesn't affect the independence of the parties in any way. It's more of a policy discussion so that there's an alignment of policy. And you don't get what happens when, you know, one arm of government wants to do something, the other arm of government is completely distrustful of the motive behind those actions. So I think that kind of approach would actually help in the relationship.
Now, let me come to Professor Oyewo. What he said, again, speaks to some of the ideals. Yeah. But there are those who talk about the fact that this interaction, if we want to call it that, in the last couple of years, has tended to demystify the judiciary in particular, with lawyers, with judges being put in the dock in front of probably junior judges to them, and being paraded in front of TV cameras, their homes being invaded by security agents, and the lawyers too, you know, suffering. And this speaks to does not speak about whether they are innocent or guilty, but just the fact. How do you react to that?
Well, you have to understand that the basic premise for the relationship between the different arms of government is based on the concept of separation of powers. So the executive function to implement the law, the judiciary functions to interpret the law. But within the concept of separation of power is the corollary concept of checks and balances. And therefore, the judiciary may check the executive in making pronouncements that the executive may not like. The same thing, executive may pursue policies that may seem inimical to the independence of the judiciary. And to go straight to the point is the issue of the pursuit of the anti-corruption policy of the government. So the anti-corruption policy of the government brings you smack, you know, into conflict with the other arms of government. So if you're going to be investigating a judge, definitely you have to, you know, conduct investigation. And if there is evidence of impropriety, you have to bring the judge before the court. And then when you bring the judge before the court, you strip him of his status of the hierarchy of courts where he is, because such prosecutions will have to start at the lower court. So for the case in point with the Code of Conduct Tribunal, you had the Code of Conduct Tribunal trying the Chief Justice of Nigeria, and it appeared to be a bit anachronistic. But the bottom line of it is that who has the jurisdiction to try for breaches of Code of Conduct? Is the Code of Conduct Tribunal. And at the end of the day, the question was there evidence enough to find the person culpable of having done? Well, the rest is history. The Chief Justice of Nigeria decided to resign and appeal, and the matter is still, you know, sub judice.
Yes, but you know, when you look at the proceedings today and you see, you know, the president being sworn in, people who I was watching it with couldn't help but say, oh, this could have been, you know, the Chief Justice that is now no longer with us. And that will always be there. Yeah. Did it leave a good taste in your mouth or not?
In terms of
especially taste, from the fact that you are a lawyer.
Yeah, for me, in terms of taste, there are all manner of food that we eat. So they give different kinds of flavor. I think this flavor, if you look at it within the milieu of the anti-corruption, you know, fight, there are some instances where the government can be said to have been vindicated because of the sheer amount of money that people had in their account. And you ask the question, you are not a manufacturer, you do this for a living and you have this. So basically, you must be able to explain. And then for other lawyers, the senior lawyers that were also seen to be cohorting with, you know, judges to compromise judgment, the course of justice by having access to them which were improper. So if an executive has an anti-corruption policy, it's not going to say, oh, judiciary, excuse me, you are not involved. Exactly. It must go across board. So I think the point is, if the judiciary is to be investigated, then they should hold themselves self-accountable because they have code of conduct. So they have things that judiciary do to keep the independence of the judiciary in order not to be compromised by other arms of government. But it doesn't mean that members of the judiciary are above the law. But the point that must be made is that what is good for the goose is good for the gander.
Yeah, but
the place where people disagree is when you pursue one arm of government and there are evidence against ministers, against director of this, director of that, and no such expeditious trial is given, investigation, prosecution, then the double standard is what gives people the impression that one arm of government is being persecuted.
When you look at the sort of person who was being prosecuted at the time, it wasn't a good time for the judiciary at all. Because a lot of senior lawyers, etc., were saying, if this can be found, this kind of wrongdoing,
the truth of the matter is that the last 4 years of the administration was not a good time for the judiciary, period. Because there was that stench of those, Supreme Court justices. That was unheard of. You invade people in the middle of the night and then stand until you are able to break down whatever and have. That's never happened in Nigeria. But the bottom line of it is that if you look at that within the context of the anti-corruption, policy, then we might say that, look, it's time for all arms of government and all persons in government to know that it's not going to be business as usual and that we are going to step on toes. But we are saying every toe should be stepped on.
Yes, every toe should be stepped on.
Yeah.
Well, I agree. First and foremost, we all agree that corruption is an issue in Nigeria. That's first. And we should not just look at the CJ. What about the Senate President? In the hierarchy, the Senate President is seen to be the number 3, higher than even the CJ. And that is the legislature. And he was actually taken to the same tribunal or court for the same or something similar. So there is no, I don't see anything wrong if what we're fighting is corruption. And if you must fight corruption, you must gather evidence. And if you must gather evidences, you must go around to investigate. It's rather unfortunate. It was in this country that is an Inspector General of Police, Tafa Balogun, was handled by a junior officer. Although his colleagues were murmuring, they were talking, but they didn't remove the fact that they had to deal with that situation. So let us look at it from the angle that we have a crusade, anti-corruption, like Prof said here, but let's ensure that this anti-corruption is across the board.
How do you see it?
Well, I would say that fairness is very important, equity is very important. Whatever it is that we do, let it be across board. But I also like the fact that we are having this discussion, especially with relationship between the judiciary and the executive. Everybody wants to see that there's a transparency, there's speed to action with regards to law cannot happen, order cannot happen if the people are not confident in the speed and the system and the speed. And so I always like to draw inferences from what has worked. And so when we take a look at the people who've done certain things right, especially with the judiciary, you look at Rwanda, who's leveraged technology to make it happen. So what is important for technology for Rwanda is that they've infused technology to see that judgment, trial, records, all of them are highly automated. So people are very transparent. People are sure about the fact that there is equity.
What about those that say the problems we have here, we cannot compare our issues to theirs? So sometimes you look at an example, but the socio-economic issues are not the same.
We cannot compare to Rwanda, you mean?
Some people will say that.
Definitely.
There is always a case and a reference. It does not have to be the same size and magnitude. The most important thing is that it's a strategic way to deal with issues, to say that I want to leverage this particular strategy to deal with that. And so whether we are bigger than them or we are smaller than them is not the issue. The issue is that technology is technology, and technology gives scale, irrespective of the size of the nation. And that's what, so for me, it's finding those sort of solutions that can bring about transparency, speed, and equity to everybody. And then there will be confidence both in the judiciary and as well as the law.
Well, we'll take a break. Yeah. We'll take a break at this point. When we come back,
we'll expand the conversation.
Exactly, and look at the impact of this relationship on other things, including even other issues that are seemingly unrelated to this particular one, but which both sides are now flexing muscles over. But that will be after the break. Please stay with us. right, welcome back. Before we took the break, we did talk about the fact that this relationship between the executive and the judiciary is beginning to have impact on other issues that may seem unrelated. One of the things on which I talked about to the panel here while we're on the break, but which I'll put first to you, Dr. Abba, is that it would appear as if, to some extent, there are swords drawn now between judges and the executive arm of government as a result of this somewhat friction-filled relationship at this point. So you find that sometimes people who come before judges, the leeway that is normally allowed has been closed, and that the judges are more inclined to give benefit of doubt to people who are broadly accused of things that they may previously have, because some of their colleagues have also been at the receiving end of this. Is this a fair comment?
No, I don't think it's fair at all, actually, because one of the tenets of the law is that it's better to free 1,000 guilty men than to convict one innocent man. So the judges will always give benefit of the doubt. They will always err on the side of ensuring that the innocent person doesn't suffer. But that is not to say that there haven't been tensions. Of course there are. Like Professor Yewa said, there have been certain things that have not happened before. We haven't raided the House of Judges before, justices of the Supreme Court. We haven't looked into corruption in the security sector the way we have now. We've never had chiefs of defense staff, chiefs of air staff, ministers of defense being publicly tried. So those things would always cause some tension between the two arms of government. That's normal and should be expected. And of course, there have been things like the president's speech talking about the rule of law not necessarily being paramount at all times. So that kind of thing will always elicit certain reactions in everybody who is a lawyer, not just the judges. Anybody who's ever been trained as a lawyer would have been taken aback by that statement. But if you look at the context of the anti-corruption fight, for instance, what you start to see is an emergence of a certain pattern. There's a realization that, look, going through the law courts, most cases on average take about 10 years to conclude in Nigeria. There are some cases of governors from 2007 where the hearing has not even commenced, and we're in 2019. So everybody looks at every anti-corruption person looks at the slowness in the system, and therefore decides to focus on, issues of prevention and issues such as code of conduct, where there's a special tribunal for that, and where the speed of trial is much faster. And that's why, like Professor Yewa said again, you've had the trial of the Senate President through the same means. Oh, sorry, I think it was your other guest. You've had the trial of the Senate President through the same means. You've had the trial of the Chief Judge through the same means. Just in the same way as the National Assembly can insist that the President must lay the budget in person before them. So these are the relationships are changing. There's no doubt about that. But being a lawyer myself, I'm entirely confident that our judges are totally professional. They will always give the benefit of the doubt where there's any likelihood that the accused or the suspect is probably innocent, and they will not allow any personal feelings they have to affect their interpretation of the law. That I'm perfectly confident about. And the higher up you go in the judicial system, the more confident I get about that fact.
Yes, Prof, let me bring it back to you. What about those who say that the judiciary is in its own way? When, for instance, the anti-corruption fight, you have 100 charges, and then, it's now 20 charges, amended charges, you add more. Then you finish with that. They bring the same set of charges before a different court is entertained. What can we do about this rigmarole?
Well, as been pointed out, we have Administration of Criminal Justice Act that has reformed most of this observation you've made.
But we're still seeing it.
Well,
without mentioning cases, we still saw it this year.
If you see that, basically the court is going to make a ruling on it. As Dr. Joe Abbas pointed out, there is a standard of justice. So justice is not whimsical, it's not arbitrary, and it's not, like we put it, as long as the foot of the judge. So basically there is a benchmark of standard. And sometimes when we forget that the concept of rule of law is an international concept that Nigeria and all nations, it serves the interest of development. So sometimes when the statement that came from the president that sometimes national interest would trump rule of law, it gives, the impression that things relating to rule of law will be put aside. Yeah. But you see, the judiciary is peopled by those who are in the community. So when something new comes, you start to understand it. You want to understand it. So it goes through a process of the development of the jurisprudence around it. And don't forget that there are new laws that will start coming out. You have the ICPC, you have the EFCC, you have the money laundering, and then you start having the cascade of what you call executive orders. Yes. Executive order number 6, executive order number 7 to elaborate. So these are new laws, and in their interpretation, you'll find out that the first thing is the court wants to understand the policy trust of these laws. And in order to achieve the policy trust, which is anti-corruption, they tend to, give a stricter interpretation, particularly where there is a conflict between extant rights, like rights of, persons coming, adjournment and all that. Then don't forget that the powers that come with it, with the executive, are enormous. So EFCC, for instance, can, on mere allegation of you being involved in anti-corruption or money laundering, have your account frozen until... So all these new things, but fortunately, we don't live in isolation. So there are international standards that are evolving by even international bodies, United Nations, Office of Drug, and all that. And the jurisprudence starts coming to form part of us, and the understanding of the judges become enriched. And that's why people think that the judges are now going, no, I think it's the normal order of things. The progression of the jurisprudence gives a balance of interest between the policy of the government and the rights of the citizen.
I'm sorry, at the point at which you reach, what just sprung to my mind is that between what Dr. Abba said and what you've said, there seems to be some correlation.
Yes.
But then on the ground, you find more and more litigants accusing judges of bias, including the EFCC, saying that, well, on the basis of what this judge has said about this particular matter, either in form of a previous statement on general principle and so on, there's a large likelihood of bias.
The attitude of a lawyer who knows the judicial system is that when you go before a judge and you don't get what you want, you have the right of appeal, not to stand like people do on TV. What about all the judgments that have been given in favor of EFCC in time past? Were those ones bad? If you accept that the administration of justice must be based on a judicial system, you can't condemn one judgment because it's against you and accept one judgment. There is an appellate system that is established. And there is no pattern that this is this. There are judgments given where
I don't think it's a case of condemning a judgment, actually, or it's a case of sometimes bringing the same matter before a different court.
No. What he talked about was condemning, because
yes, because you have people, yes,
of a particular judge, Justice Taiwo of the Federal High Court.
Yeah, that's the most current example. That's the most current example.
So,
but other people do.
But what they should have done is to go on appeal. If the judgment, you go, that's why we have appeal. You take it that it will be 3 judges, it will be 5 judges, 7 judges. So I don't think...
It also does, Mr. Likpede, it does appear as if, though, the one court that still retains, in spite of the more recent interaction between them and the executive, it still retains some level of respect, is the Supreme Court. Maybe because, as Justice
Yes.
Okuta said, we are final. Not because we are infallible, but, you know, we are infallible because we are final. But other courts are fair game, depending on who is before them.
Well, I'll say that, you see, human beings, when something doesn't favor you, you create an excuse.
But the lawyers help.
Just hold on, madam. You create an excuse for that particular thing. Two things can look similar, but there might be factors that doesn't make them similar. Now, the second thing is that the High Court, you have a single judge using an interpreting aid. Then if you are not satisfied, you go to the appeal court. It's not one judge. It's more than one. So three of them, two good heads, they say are better than one. But 2, 3, 4, 5. Then if you are not even satisfied, then you go to the Supreme Court. It's not peculiar to Nigeria. It's everywhere. If you can recall, I'm sorry to refer to that, appointing a Supreme Court judge in America by Obama and after by Trump was a major issue. Because they were believing that this is a Democrat-inclined judge and that one is a Republican-inclined judge, and that they wanted a 4-5 or
in favor of one side
or the other. Now, I mean, that's not, you can see that in the judiciary system, whatever you go through from the first court, you have the opportunity to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been given that final authority. But don't forget that in this country, there is only one chief executive. That chief executive is Mr. President, who upholds even the law that the judiciary operates. That's where myself and Prof will fight this night.
Exactly.
He is the custodian. And he's the one that is responsible for his campaign on corruption. He is the one responsible for the morality or otherwise of the judges, the legislature, the executive. And at the end of the day, he is being measured based on whatever any of those sectors does. Therefore, you cannot get it too wrong with the judges. If you go to a judge, now I'm going to back him, and you find $75 million or naira or whatever, and you cannot explain the source. Maybe the judges are the ones that are getting the heat. We're still going to find a situation that civil servants will have to start explaining. Okay? Politicians are also explaining now. Right? Military men are explaining. There will be a time that even lawyers and artisans on the road will explain. And then we will know that this anti-corruption crusade is the major policy of President Buhari. He's standing on it. I heard this morning that he had declared his assets. And that he did, what I was waiting for was
the additions.
The additions. I was waiting for the additions. And according to information declared, there were no additions from what he had before
and what he is now.
And what he declared now. I choose my words.
Very carefully.
Carefully. What he had before and what was being declared now. Until otherwise, according to my prof here.
Until otherwise proven. Until otherwise proven to be false.
That's what he has said. So as the number one person, I expect my friend now, the vice president, and who is a lawyer, who is a professor also, to follow suit. And also all the governors. And then people will see that it's not only about the judiciary. Maybe the judiciary now will have to declare their assets.
But will that happen in the next 4 years? Because until what you're saying comes to pass, there will still be this, oh, it is selective, it's a selective fight.
Well, it's a process.
I think one thing that has to be made clear from taking from what he has said, we have to make it clear that the arms of government are independent and autonomous to some extent. So they hold themselves also accountable. Irrespective of the anti-corruption. It is not the anti-corruption policy is to correct an anomaly. The normal thing is that there is a judicial code of ethics. Just like there is a professional code of ethics for lawyers, for doctors, for engineers and all that. It is because things have gone down.
Yes, that's the ideal.
Let's face it, the president is not the main conscience or morality for the nation. Otherwise, I mean, the people around the president will also have to be held accountable. But one thing we have to acknowledge, that even in the concept of separation of powers, in Nigeria, there is the sphere of what you call political influence in the interaction between the arms of government. So, for instance, the executive will want to push through their policy, even when those policies are not being applied to themselves. If you talk about anti-corruption, charity must begin from the house. The president must be seen to have been calling ministers and all the people in the presidency to order.
Professor Oyo, I'm sorry,
yes.
I want to put you on pause because I want to ask Mrs. Malize about the impact of all of this on business. You are representing an organization that specializes in business, and we hear all manners of people talking about the need for us to get investors, both foreign, direct, and other. Given your experience, what has been the impact of this, all this, I don't know what to call it, maybe brouhaha, you know, on that effort?
It simply boils down to how does all of that affect the business of the nation and the economy of the nation, especially with regards to foreign direct investment. So when people begin to see that there is a strong judiciary system, that there is equity, that there is speed to action, and then there is also transparency, then there will also be increased confidence to begin to want to invest in that country. And so when people are not certain, and which is the reason why most of the time you hear, this is a nation that is very corrupt, and so people are wondering, can I do business in that nation? And so global companies, for instance, who also have global laws they abide by global laws, may not also be free to invest in such places because, of course, they are not confident in the... But I think that to a very large extent, we are doing better, we are going well, it's the opportunity of investment in this nation. So I think that the discussion should actually be how can the judiciary and the executive create the sort of structures that would enable corruption be eroded, just so that there is fairness, the speed of trial, so people are brought accountable. We need to have a totally different value system that positions our country so that people can begin to say, oh yes, to be honest with you, there is an improvement, at least in terms of corruption. So people can be attracted to coming into the country. Nobody wants to run businesses and operations in a place where people are totally corrupt. And so that's why we must also make references to the nations that have started to do things to position themselves. So the index in terms of corruption is better, so there is ease of doing business, there's foreign direct investment, and the more we create those sort of positive stories, the more the economy becomes buoyant because there will be interest in investments. And that's where we should be going, really, so that the economy will pick up, so that we can begin to drive an economy that people are confident in as citizens, as business owners, and most importantly, as people who are prepared to attract the world to it.
Well,
okay, just to say, I remember you saying that the Vice President should follow suit, but just to say that he has done that through his special advisor on research, legal and compliance matters, that's Dr. Bilkis Saidu. That has been submitted to the CCB, and it has been found that there's no significant difference between what he had when he came in and what he's declaring right now.
And it's also true that our judges are still very reputable, notwithstanding what we're saying. They've gone through our training, and they have the character. We can't run that down. Investors will look at, if I have a dispute, can I trust the judiciary, the arbitration, to assist me?
What about some of them that say that it's only when it's at the top that is so quick and, you know, justice is dispensed? There's so many cases of people in business who are scammed, who go to say, look, this has happened to me. 10 years, they're still on it.
Well, I think on that bit, we have to acknowledge that there have been reforms. In the civil, administration of civil justice, which is what we are talking about. For instance, in Lagos State, Lagos State has had a lot of reforms. They've had commercial courts. They have multi-door. They have so many innovations that they've brought.
What's multi-door?
Oh, the multi-door court system is like integrating what do you call it? An alternative dispute resolution approach into the administration of justice. So when a matter comes before the court quickly looks at it and tells the parties, this is a matter that can be settled, and then you go to the multi-door, and they ask lawyers to leave.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's like arbitration, is
it? Yes, yeah, they ask lawyers to leave. And then when the lawyers leave...
I think it's when they leave that they now
in fact, that's the truth of the matter.
Themselves.
So when the lawyers leave, in most cases, the parties are there, and in the absence of the lawyers, nobody guiding them and tutoring them about their rights, they concede everything, and the matter is solved.
Okay, Prof, before you continue, we're going to take a short break and expand the conversation like we always say. What should we expect in the next 4 years from the kind of relationship the judiciary and the executive have so that we can move forward? But we'll do that when we come back.
Welcome back. While we're on break, of course, especially here in the Lagos studios, the discussion continues. Dr. Abba, let me bring you up to speed about what was happening while we were on break, because I only wish you could be part of it. But what essentially we're looking at this from policy development angles now. Everywhere else in the world, there's a linkage, as I believe both Mr. Lipede, Mr. Bedizo, and Professor Ewo were saying, that there's a linkage between what the executive does in pushing out policy and what the judiciary does in supporting it to see the light, the light of day, and for everybody to have a buy-in, including the legislature. But in Nigeria, that may not necessarily be the case at this point, because as it pointed out, the Senate President was on trial before the Chief Justice, even though ultimately he was found not guilty. But that process dragged on for quite a while. The Chief Justice case, of course, is still ongoing. So it may not be exactly the same. If we're now looking at the next 4 years, what does that portend, especially because we expect this new administration, even though with the same head, to hit the ground running? And the president has said, well, if I was called Baba Go Slow during the first term, this time I'm going to show that I can be a lot faster. These are some of the things that can enable it, isn't it?
It certainly is, and I like that you brought in the role of the legislature, because it's actually very important in everything that we discuss. We talked about the executive developing the policies and the judiciary ensuring its enforcement. But we often do not focus sufficiently on the role of the legislature. If you take the asset declaration issue that we're talking about, in my view, when we decide to be serious, asset declaration will be annual, it will be public, it will be mandatory. And so today we focus on, the president has said this and the president and the vice president hasn't done that. How many civil servants have actually declared their assets across the 36 states? And, I was in a meeting with the chairman of the Code of Conduct Bureau last week, and he made the point that the politicians actually comply a lot more than the public servants do, the civil servants do, because the politicians know how much they have to lose if they don't comply. So we tend not to focus sufficiently on that side of things. But if the legislature had been to make asset declaration annual, mandatory, and public, then I think that will go a long way to reducing the incidence of corruption, and that's a matter of policy. And that's why I started off with this leadership. This leadership committee that they have in Kaduna, where the three arms of government discuss and agree issues of policy, and everybody understands their roles within that. It's difficult to say what will happen in the next 4 years. We have to take the president at his own words. However, the issue of checks and balances means that he can't actually run faster than the legislature. He can't run faster than the judiciary either, no matter how fast he wants to run. And that's why there's a need for the three arms of government to work together if we're going to make any significant progress. Yes,
Dr.
the president has a lot of power. Yes, he's the number one.
Mr. Alikpede has pointed out that he can set the pace, even if he can't run faster than them, but that he can set the pace.
He can certainly set the pace, and he can certainly set the pace. But like I said, if it doesn't matter how quick a pace is set, if your budget is not passed for 7 months, there's really not much you can do. If the case you take to court doesn't get tried for 10 years, there's not much you can do.
Again, Mr. Alikpede says
yes,
he still has other money to spend.
You have no, the money you have to spend is actually only recurrent expenditure to stop the government from grinding to a halt. You know, and even then, you can only spend, I think, up to 50% before 50% of the capital budget before the new bill is passed. So you spend the recurrent expenditure because people have to be paid. Government offices have to be, you have to pay electricity bills, you have to keep government going. Otherwise, you know, the society will grind to a halt. So that's what you have, but you can't embark on any new capital projects. And if there are time-sensitive projects you want to do that is affected by climate, like, you know, the rains and all of that, you're completely hamstrung. And you know, the nature of the public service is that nobody wants to start a procurement not knowing when the money will come, particularly as even the money to start the procurement, to place all the adverts and all that, is in the budget. And so, you know, you can't underestimate how much damage a non-cooperative legislature or a non-cooperative judiciary can do to the executive. And that's what the concept of checks and balances represent. What we should hope for is that there should be a more healthy relationship between these three arms of government geared towards a common good that everybody understands. That's, I think, what we should aim for in the next 4 years.
Yeah, but Prof, you hear Dr. Abba, say annual, mandatory, and it should be public. Knowing the way we are as Nigerians, how are we going to do that? The next thing you hear is, oh, they started with me because I'm Igbo. They have not done this other person's, you know. How do we get past our culture, our tribe, and all that when we want to talk about transparency?
I think one thing we have to make clear is that the Code of Conduct is a constitutional imposition, and it is no respecter of persons. It is the implementation. And what needs to be done is that the machinery for the implementation should be made to be more effective, so that it will not be seen as a witch hunting, you know, mechanism. That is when you want to get somebody, like it was taught in the case of the CJN, that you now activate it. But if it is an ongoing and is being developed, and capacity for its, you know, implementation is being increased, it will have a paper trail of a benchmark by which you can judge somebody. If subsequently he leaves the office and the property suddenly comes, you can say, oh, this property actually should have been declared during this period. So the person breached the summit, because merely declaring the something and saying I did not earn anything, I may wait till after I've left the office before those things start to become. And
then also,
by which time I don't have any obligation to declare my code of conduct.
When he says public, it also means that you should be able to verify that is actually what it is.
Yes, it should be accessible. And people should, for instance, most of these things are within the public domain, as the Freedom of Information Act has made it possible for you to demand for it. So if it's a record that you can demand for within the limits of the exceptions, within the freedom of... So these are documents that you can
although whether you get it is another...
Well, you can...
No, but speaking about that, in terms of the legalistic part of it, there's the Freedom of Information Act.
Yes.
But then Code of Conduct forms are supposed to be secretly held. And it's only if you think that there's something that someone has that he may or
So
may
you-
not have
you-
declared,
yeah,
you
that's-
indicate to
yes.
the Code of Conduct
But-
Bureau,
yeah.
and they go and check.
And
then if it turns out right, they may
yes.
follow it up or something. So
Let-
there's still
let-
that.
let me just say here that we always look at laws and say it will take forever, it will not work because of tribalism and this. Let us start. Every step that we take in the right direction is giving us a better image. Now, it is true, those who you will start with will make noise. But the noise is not what we're interested in, is the welfare of this country. So I think that my brother in Abuja has said what we should have been doing 19 years ago, 20 years ago. And it shouldn't be politicians alone. It should be from, look, I'd like to let you know here that no governor signs a check. The president doesn't sign a check.
Yeah.
He doesn't. And he cannot even approve without a prayer from the civil servants. Okay? Therefore, everybody could be guilty. I'm very careful because I have the lawyers around me. I'm very careful.
You are covered.
To use the word that could be guilty of being part of that process if something goes wrong. So therefore, how do you explain a director that has 10 houses?
Mrs. Malizi, you see this kind of thing in business. You know, you want to invest and you're worried about your partner. What he's talking about, how does it play out?
Well, it cuts across, and that's why, for me, it's beyond the judiciary. It's about changing all of our value system, as a matter of fact.
Exactly.
Because every single one of us is responsible for all of the stories and positioning that go out about the nation. So whether it's the judiciary, whether they are citizens, whether they are individuals, corporations, and all of that, let's begin to think of a way that we can hold everybody accountable to contributing to the positive stories by way of what sort of value system drivers? So we are not consistently talking corruption, but we are consistently talking about the sort of values that promote honesty, integrity, world-class values that make us position our nation.
How specifically have you been able to achieve that in your own experience? Because we keep hearing we should do something about our value system, and it ends as talk. But in your experience, what have you done differently?
Well, in our own experiences, not just as an individual, but I mean, I'll talk from the perspective of corporations, because it's easier for corporations. We can borrow from them where we've put systems and framework in place for audit, accountability, reporting, and all of that. And that's the reason why you find out that they are the ones that are, I mean, when you talk about transparency, you talk about reporting, it's easier, especially like publicly quoted companies are open, everybody can take it. Yeah. So if we begin to take a cue from all of those sort of systems and structures that exist, especially in corporations, especially in the private sector, then we'll be able to, where there is accountability, where there is measurement, where there is sanction, where there is punishment, where people, then every side of government, every aspect of government, whether it is the judiciary, and of course we need also that it's visionary. So from the executive angle, it has to be visionary to say this is the direction we want the nation to go.
Why is it that when you ask for accountability or maybe a public officer or something, there's this feeling of why are you asking? You know, there's this defensive feeling you get. But look at Britain. Andrea Litsom, a little thing. Oh, I resign. I'm no longer interested and all that. My books are open. It's not like that in this part of the world. I don't know.
Well, I'm sorry, sir. I just wanted to put this. Maybe you also need to address, because sometimes they couch the refusal under the immunity. There's an act that dates back from the 50s. Official Secrets Act, which is that in spite of this Freedom of Information Act, there are certain things that you can't ask for.
I think the Official Secrets Act has been seriously impacted by the Freedom of Information Act. Those things that will be, unaccessible must relate to security and information that can harm the public, So, and bottom line, if it is rejected, you take it to court. And then the judiciary can ask for a private viewing of that thing that is official, that is secret.
But why are they offended or they feel, why are you asking me, you know,
Well,
I'm
basically,
fine. What is your problem? You know, there's
Yeah,
this.
you were a political officer, there, so maybe.
Yes,
let-
you're already
let-
taking
let-
offense, and there's a wall up. Rather than, oh, fantastic, yeah, it is. It's more of, why do you want it?
Unfortunately, we have inherited a culture over a period of time, and it has become part of the system, but it's not a good system. Okay? There is nothing secretive about what you're doing. First, everybody takes from federal government. Whatever comes to you is available through central bank. So, even if it doesn't give you the figures, you can ask central bank. About 4 or 5 years, they've been publishing what they were giving states and what they were giving
Local
governments.
Yes.
And it is easy for you to find out how much is being spent out, how much this man has collected. Where you will have an issue is the IGR, which is the internally generated revenue. And probably that's why you find a lot of aggression. You know, sorry to use that.
No, that's the word.
But whatever is given to states, local governments, come from federation account, is available to everybody to check. And you can accumulate it over a year and say, Mr. Governor, in 1 year, you have been given 300 billion. I mean,
What have you done with it?
What have you been able to achieve with it? But that's not to say that he's not working. In executive arm of government, there are certain factors that you do not see in taking his decisions. For example, what you think is right, and we all see that this is an economic, it would make an economic advantage. It might not make a political advantage. It might not also make a social advantage. Yeah. And he might look at it from this angle and say, no, I need to balance it. We found ourselves in that situation. That if I have to do one for the Yorubas, I must look at the Igbos, and I must look at the Hausas, and do almost the same thing. Even if it doesn't make any economic sense to situate the same thing in the other two regions.
I think we've gotten to the root of our problem now.
Isn't that coming with something for
That is the root of it.
our culture?
Incredible. I can't believe it.
Dr. Abba, no, just a moment, Professor Iwo, just a moment.
No,
Dr. Abba,
Prof,
Dr. Abba,
let me, sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
No, we will.
Why I want to take up Dr. Abba is this. Dr. Abba, of course, Mr. Likbade has spoken as a grassroots politician, I mean, a past chairman of a local government. But until more recently, you were a top civil servant. And not only were you a top civil servant, you played a role in what is supposed to be the reform process of the civil service and how it relates to good governance and issues related thereto. So this should be right up your alley. And why I ask this is that Mr. Likbade has been frank enough to talk about political imperatives, social imperatives, economic imperatives. Yeah. At the federal level, is this the case? And if so, again, looking out of there, how do you tackle this kind of thing, knowing fully well that everyone who finds himself or herself in this position has the same problem?
Well, I think it's important to understand roles. You know, the role of the politician is to develop policy. That's the role of the politician. So the minister, the governor, the president, their role is to develop policy. The role of the civil servant is to assist them in that policy development process and to guide them about the extant rules and procedures that exist so that they don't actually get themselves into trouble and probably even sometimes into jail. And so there's always this tension between what the politician wants to do and what the civil servant says they are able to do. And that tension is often because the politician is in a hurry. He's only got 4 years at most. The civil servant has got 35 years. And so the speed with which the politician wants to work sometimes goes against the intendments of the law. And so if you take procurement, for instance, the Procurement Act will require you to advertise publicly for 6 weeks. The politician doesn't have 6 weeks, but the law says you must advertise for 6 weeks. Why? So that he can give people, he can give everyone the opportunity to compete for that work. And by giving everyone the opportunity to compete for that work, he recognizes that what we're dealing with is public money from the Commonwealth. The politician, on the other hand, has to favor party members, has to favor the grassroots. And so it is not in the interest of the politician to go through due process. And so you have these tensions, and so that's why a good civil servant will say to the politician, well, this is what you can and cannot do. And if the politician says no, the civil servant will put it in writing. And in my experience, whenever a civil servant puts it in writing, the politician becomes more wary because they can't then misbehave. So unless you're not a smart civil servant, it's only a civil servant that is not smart that will take an instruction from the politician verbally. Because when the trouble starts, the politician will deny all knowledge.
Oh, straight.
You know, so whenever a politician is asking you to do something you don't want to do, ask for it in writing. First of all, the politician is unlikely to put it in writing. And when they do, and you give your advice and they don't take it, you must document that advice so that it's on record. So that tension is always there. And this is not only in Nigeria, it happens all over the world. It will always be there. But if you take the rules that the civil servants work under, I often say that a civil servant is actually more worried about rules than of laws. And so if you say to a civil servant, if you move this cup from here to here, it's a breach of the civil service rules and you could be sanctioned and you could lose your job. They actually take that more seriously than if you say, if you move this cup from here to here, you've broken the law. Because they'll think, okay, so how many people are breaking the law? I mean, well, you know, when will it get to my turn? There are 5 million of us, public servants. When will I ever be prosecuted? But if I move this cup and it's against civil service rules, and I'm reported, I could actually lose my job very swiftly and lose my pension and lose my seniority. And that's why even the tension, or what looks like a tension between the Official Secrets Act and the Freedom of Information Act doesn't really exist, because I always say that the Freedom of Information Act is the second most powerful law in the country. And I say that because you can only rely on the Constitution in order not to give information under the Freedom of Information Act. But a civil servant will still quote the Official Secrets Act, because that is the oath he took when he joined the civil service. And that's why we're enjoying the head of service to simply issue a circular to say the Freedom of Information Act has now superseded the Official Secrets Act. If she issues that circular tomorrow, you will see a dramatic change. It doesn't matter how many times the FOI Act is amended. That circular will actually have a much more profound impact on the behavior of the civil servant than any amendment of the law or any imposition of penalties in the Act. So this is the way the system runs. But that tension is normal. It happens all over the world. The politician will always be a politician, but the role of the civil servant is to safeguard the interest of the country and safeguard the Commonwealth and the common resources that we all have.
Mr.
And I think,
like
you know...
yes, I'm going to...
Sorry, Dr. Abba. It appears as though Mr. Likwade disagrees to some extent.
Well, I want to say that some of the politicians that you talk about have come from the private sector. And in private sector, like she said, things move. Now, if the politicians have a policy and the civil servants are to implement it, now he's made the policy and he's asked you to implement it, and you have a disagreement, you can sit down together and have that agreement. But look at it today. How many civil servants have been tried for misappropriation? How many? Compared to the politicians that have done it. And those things that were done, there must have been a prayer submitted by the civil servants for the politicians to do.
Or booby traps set.
Or whatever. Well, it's very, I want to agree with him. There is a last line they would normally put, you may wish to approve.
Yes, yes.
When they put that, if you're a smart politician, you don't go there because it's a trap. Okay?
Well, I think the tension that Dr. Joe Abba painted is real. And the point that you are making, we have to acknowledge that the policies that have been coming since 1999 during the democracy, because we are celebrating democracy,
indeed,
points towards that, because we are going towards transparency and accountability. And there are so many reforms. For instance, there is also civil service reform to limit how they can sabotage, policy implementation. I think Dr. Joe Abba sits on one of such, sat on such a, which is the Bureau of Public
Sector Reform,
and all that.
But is there any measure of how far the reforms are going?
Yeah, the reforms, you have to understand that reforms will depend on the implementation. So if you have a framework, how do you implement it? So we are even talking about anti-corruption. We didn't even talk about even how government does business. We have the TSA that has come as a part of the reform. We have code of conduct that's come part of the reform. We have
ease of doing business.
We have constant legislative lawmaking and reforms that are going on. So democracy is a process, and we need to get the perspective that democracy is about governance and development. What we need to understand is the role of the different arms of government. And as Dr. Abba has said, executive sets the policy, and the civil servants are to, implement. But the tension will always be there because of background. If a person never worked with civil service, he will not even understand the implementation of a query. If you issue a query to a civil servant, you are threatening his existence. So he's going to respond, So it's good that we have the mix. It is when people come from more and more having people with track record of accomplishment in the private sector, mixing with public sector, we see, the dynamism that comes with it.
You want to do that mix, and then they tell you you're not a politician, you came from the private sector, you don't understand politics, this is the way we run. That's what you hear.
I just think, Prof, that we need to reform the civil service.
Yeah. Let me give the last minute.
In line with what
before we go
happening.
a break, Mr. Likwede, let me give the last minute to Ms. Malize.
Yeah, I was just going to emphasize the fact that we've seen quite a lot of people come from the private sector into public service who's done remarkably well.
Yes.
And a good number of times they bring the sort of systems and framework that exists, that you've experienced in the private sector. And then things work. Things work quicker, swifter, and faster with them.
They are blamed for coming from the private sector when they don't succeed. Not like when those in the public sector don't succeed. Not that they don't exist.
I think it's better for us to
I would like to come into that at some point,
Yes,
please.
Perhaps after the break.
Maybe after the break.
After the break,
let's
sir,
take the
please.
break. When we come back, Ms. Malize, you finish your point. Then we'll come back to you, Dr. Abba.
Okay.
We're actually now on the real home stretch, the last 8 or so minutes. As we promised, Ms. Malize, you have a point to conclude, and before we go to Dr. Joe Abba.
Well, yes, we're talking about bringing learnings from the private sector. And we have seen how the private sector has done extremely well. And I say it all the time, if the economy of this nation is driven like the way that the private sector is driving organizations within that sector, trust me, we would see a whole lot of improvement. After all, it's actually the sector that is truly driving the economy, whether you're looking at corporations, blue chip companies, small businesses and individuals who are entrepreneurs and driving great things. So the systems and structures that they have put in place have enabled them to catalyze growth, focus, drive, and most importantly, measure impact from time to time, which is one of the things that we lose or we don't achieve a lot in the public sector. And so take, for instance, a lot of the organizations in Nigeria and the individuals who are driving employment, growth, economic indices shooting up just because the private sector is doing well, from financial service sector to manufacturing, entertainment, fashion, style, and all of those. They're driving the economy very well. There's so much to learn from the private sector, and it would be nice that we begin to move much more people into the public sector from the private sector, so that the sort of discipline and vision and strategy that you find in, and discipline also that you find in that sector is also infused into the public sector.
Dr. Abba, you wanted to make a comment. I'm going to give you 90 seconds to do that so that we'll make the rounds of the conclusions of this. Please go ahead.
I'll use my 90 seconds to challenge the arrogance of the private sector, actually. Nobody's born into the public sector.
Something told me that was
Everybody
coming,
comes into
yeah.
the public sector from the private sector. Everybody comes into the public sector from the private sector. And so the issue, of course, there's a lot to learn from the private sector. But the private sector has one motive, and that is to make money, to make profit. There's no other motive. Everything else is window dressing, whether you call it corporate social responsibility or anything else. The purpose is to make money and to make profit. The purpose of the public sector is very, very different. The public sector has to worry about representation. It has to worry about federal character. It has to spend public money in a particular way and not in another way. So the issues are very, very different. But of course, we can take lessons from the private sector. But this notion that the private sector is somehow perfect and the public sector is useless is one of the biggest fallacies that exist. Actually, the public servants are much better trained than many private sector executives. Indeed, in 2000 and early...
Dr. Abba, I want you to start the round of the way forward now.
Before that,
the synergy.
Respond,
no. If we go on with that, we won't. We're out of time. No, hold on. When we come to her, she can make that clarification.
No, like, let her make her points, please. Usually I say fine, but this time let her make her points.
Let the ladies have their way.
Yes, please make your points. Yes.
I'm extremely certain that Dr. Abba did not misunderstand me. I'm very certain that he knows that we're talking about partnership and collaboration between both sectors and infusing also experiences from the private sector into the public sector for the good of the nation. Yes. So whether the private sector is focused on profit, the profit is because they need to grow the economies of individual. So they create jobs, they create enabling environment, so individual families are able to pick all of their bills and grow all of their dreams. So it's also in the interest of the nation. And of course, the public sector is, building the sort of framework and enabling environment that makes it possible for both sectors to work collaboratively. So I know that he does understand that too.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, go back.
Has the point been made now? So I think Dr. Abba, you can now start the round of the way forward. You have a minute to do that.
Please, Dr. Abba.
Okay, the way forward is to like my sister said, ensure synergy between both the public sector and the private sector. We should put in place exchange schemes where a civil servant or public servant can go and, if you like, intern in a private sector organization for 6 months, and vice versa, so that the private sector people don't make as many mistakes as they currently do when they come into the public service. But back to where we started. Yes. It's also my same recommendation for synergy between the executive, the judiciary, but also the legislature. I think if the principal officers of the three arms can come together and agree on policy direction, I think that should reduce a lot of the tension that currently exists.
No doubt.
Professor Ewo.
Yeah.
Well, taking it from where he, left it, it's very important that we understand that each arm of government has different roles to play. So this tension is part of the doing of their work. There will always be clashes. But from the experience of 2015 to 2019, I think the executive and the judiciary, they have better appreciation of each other now. And I believe that the period of naivete is out of it. So going forward, from the lessons learned from 2015 to 2019, I think the executive will better appreciate that the power is not only in one hand. If you treat the judiciary in a way that they feel oversteps yourself, then you can start harvesting some hostile judgment. That will be a stumbling block in your policy. And that's how, going into what Dr. Juaba said, is that there must be synergy. Because the bottom line of it is that whether you are in the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary, we must understand that the powers given to you is being exercised for the generality of Nigerians. So the judiciary itself must be self-accountable. They must hold themselves by the oath of office and the ethics of their profession. So
I'm going to have to put you on pause, Mr. Alikadi.
Thank you very much. I'm only going to use one word.
Yes.
And that is they should trust one another. There must be that trust that this is the executive, I trust you. This is the judiciary.
Sorry, in democracy there is distrust.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Trust
and then I'm going to add the
go.
populace to it. We must trust the government. Whatever decisions or policies are thrown out, it is thrown out to help the nation. First, try to manage it, observe it, before you begin to condemn it on arrival.
Pause, sir. Mrs. Balize.
I'll take it from what I truly believe in. I believe that, for starters, governance and leadership is for growth and development. So in that case, it's important that the judiciary, the executive, see themselves as people who must partner to the regards that they must work together to move the nation forward. So self-interest shouldn't override anything. So if the objective and the overall goal is to catalyze growth and development, then everything is just about to what degree does this help the nation move forward. And then if that's the major thing that we're looking at, then it becomes very visionary, it becomes much the direction and not self-interest or personal interest or offices and positions. So it's just about creating growth and development for the nation. So
indeed, that's a good point to leave it. Yeah. And at this point, we'd like to say a very big thank you to you for staying with us right from 7 a.m. in the morning.
7,
yes. So that would be just about a few seconds under 12 hours ago. Want to thank you. Want to thank our guests here, Dr. Joaba in our Abuja studios. Thank you for being with us. And here in Lagos, Professor Oyewo, Mr. Lukbede, and Mrs. Belize, thank you for being with us. Very robust, very interesting, contentious at times discussion. And we thoroughly enjoyed that. I'm sure our viewers did too. So, Ijoma, time to say...
Yeah, that's right. Time to say goodbye. Happy Democracy Day out there. Let's start the next 4 years today.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.